The strongest person in the room is usually the one nobody bothers listening to. Snow drifted softly through downtown Chicago while long lines of headlights reflected across wet winter streets beneath glowing skyscrapers and silent December clouds. Inside Brooks and Hart Steakhouse, warm amber light spilled across polished wooden floors while expensive whiskey glasses clinked gently beneath the low sound of jazz piano near the fireplace. The restaurant sat on the 34th floor overlooking the city skyline, famous among executives for privacy, expensive wine, and conversations worth millions of dollars. Claire Dawson moved quietly between tables carrying a silver tray balanced carefully against one arm, while wealthy guests barely noticed her existence. She wore a simple black waitress uniform with a white collar and sleeves rolled neatly to her wrists. Nothing about her appearance invited attention, and Claire preferred it that way. Invisible people learn more about the world because nobody guarded their words around them. Near the center of the restaurant, the Brooks family occupied the private dining section beside the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Lake Michigan. Richard Brooks sat silently at the head of the table, silver hair glowing softly beneath the restaurant lighting while age and exhaustion rested heavily behind his tired eyes. Beside him sat his oldest son Ethan Brooks wearing a dark charcoal suit and a cold expression sharpened by years of business negotiations and impossible expectations. Across from Ethan sat Noah Brooks, younger by 6 years, quieter, dressed in a navy sweater instead of formal business clothes. Tension moved between the brothers like invisible static nobody at the table wanted to acknowledge openly. Claire approached carefully carrying fresh glasses of sparkling water, while conversation at the table grew sharper beneath forced politeness. "You cannot keep avoiding responsibility forever," Ethan said calmly while adjusting the cuff of his watch. Noah looked down briefly before answering. "I am not avoiding anything." Ethan leaned back slowly in his chair. "Then explain why you disappeared during the investor meetings last month." Richard Brooks closed his eyes briefly beside them as though exhaustion had already heard this argument too many times before. Noah's jaw tightened slightly. "I told you already. I had something more important." Ethan gave a dry laugh beneath his breath. "More important than saving the company." Claire quietly replaced water glasses while pretending not to hear the conversation. Years in hospitality had taught her how to become invisible during private family arguments. But she noticed details anyway. Noah looked tired in a different way than Ethan. Not careless, burdened. Meanwhile, Ethan carried the kind of confidence wealthy people used when they believed pressure belonged only to them. Claire stepped back from the table after refilling the glasses. "Would anyone like more coffee?" she asked softly. Ethan barely glanced at her. "No," Noah offered a polite small smile. "I am okay, thank you." Richard looked toward Claire longer than expected. "Actually," the older man said gently, "another coffee would be nice." Claire nodded once. "Of course, sir." She disappeared quietly toward the service station near the bar while snow pressed softly against the restaurant windows behind the Brooks family. Ethan rubbed his temple once while staring toward his younger brother again. "You know what the board thinks about you now." Noah looked tired already. "I honestly do not care anymore." Ethan's voice hardened slightly. "That is exactly the problem." Nearby executives at surrounding tables continued laughing over expensive dinners while candlelight flickered softly across crystal glasses. But tension at the Brooks table deepened steadily beneath the elegant atmosphere. Claire returned carrying fresh coffee moments later. She carefully placed the cup beside Richard Brooks before reaching for the empty water pitcher near Ethan's side. At that exact moment, Ethan spoke sharply toward Noah again. "One day father will not be here protecting you." Noah pushed his chair back slightly. "You think this is about protection?" Ethan's expression remained cold. "I think you have spent your entire life expecting everyone else to clean up your mistakes." The words landed harder than Ethan intended. Noah stood quietly from the table, visibly wounded despite trying not to show it. Richard sighed heavily beneath the warm restaurant lighting. "Enough." But Ethan continued anyway. "Noah disappears for weeks, misses investor meetings, hides financial information, and somehow I am still expected to trust him with this company." Claire noticed Noah's hands trembling slightly near the edge of the table. Not anger. Stress. Fear maybe. Ethan finally looked toward Claire while she poured water into his glass. "Careful." His voice carried mild irritation. "You almost spilled." Claire glanced calmly toward the untouched water line near the edge of the glass. It did not spill, sir. Ethan looked at her directly for the first time all evening. Her voice surprised him somehow. Not defensive, not timid, simply calm. He gave a faint dismissive smile. Confidence from a waitress. That is new. Noah immediately frowned. Ethan. But Ethan barely noticed the warning in his brother's voice. Claire remained composed while setting down the pitcher carefully. People can do difficult things quietly, she answered softly. Ethan leaned back, slightly amused now. And what difficult thing are you doing exactly? Silence settled briefly across the table. Claire met his eyes calmly without embarrassment. My job. Noah almost smiled despite the tension. Richard Brooks watched Claire carefully now with quiet interest behind tired eyes. Ethan gave a short laugh beneath his breath. You know what I think? Claire waited politely. Ethan gestured lightly toward the elegant restaurant around them. I think people confuse calmness with strength because it sounds poetic. Claire adjusted the silver tray against her arm gently. Sometimes people confuse loudness with leadership for the same reason. Complete silence fell across the table instantly. Noah looked down, trying unsuccessfully to hide a reaction. Even Richard Brooks stared at Claire with quiet surprise. Ethan's expression hardened slightly, though not entirely from anger. More from the uncomfortable realization that the waitress standing beside his table had answered him without fear. Claire offered a polite nod afterward as though nothing unusual had happened. Your coffee, sir, she said softly toward Richard before turning calmly toward the service station again. Ethan watched her walk away beneath the warm amber lighting while snow continued falling outside across the Chicago skyline. Strange. Most people became nervous around him. Defensive. Eager to impress. But Claire Dawson had spoken to him like someone who understood something he did not. And for reasons Ethan could not explain yet, that bothered him far more than it should have. Snow continued falling outside Brooks and Hart Steakhouse while the city lights of Chicago shimmered beneath layers of winter fog and slow-moving traffic. Inside the restaurant, soft jazz drifted beneath warm amber lighting while wealthy guests laughed quietly over expensive wine and late dinners. But tension still lingered around the Brooks family table near the tall windows overlooking Lake Michigan. Ethan Brooks remained seated with one hand resting near his untouched whiskey glass, while replaying Claire Dawson's words inside his mind. Sometimes people confuse loudness with leadership. Nobody spoke to him that way, especially not a waitress. Across the table, Noah Brooks stared silently out the window while Richard Brooks rubbed tired fingers against his temple. The older man looked exhausted now, older than he had only an hour earlier. Claire moved calmly between tables, collecting empty plates while pretending not to notice Ethan occasionally watching her from across the restaurant. She had seen men like him before. Wealthy, intelligent, certain the world rewarded strength while quietly overlooking kindness, because kindness could not be measured in quarterly reports or stock value. Near the service station beside the kitchen entrance, another waitress leaned closer toward Claire while polishing wine glasses. You know he owns half the buildings downtown, right? Claire glanced toward Ethan briefly before continuing to organize silverware. Good for him. The younger waitress lowered her voice dramatically. People say he fired an executive once during Christmas dinner. Claire gave the faintest smile. People say many things when they are afraid of someone. The waitress stared at her in disbelief. You are not scared of him? Claire carefully folded another napkin beside the silverware tray. No, why not? Claire paused for one quiet second. Because angry people are usually carrying pain, not power. Nearby, Chef Louise called for another dessert order while kitchen doors swung open beneath bursts of warm light and steam. Claire picked up a tray carrying fresh coffee and cheesecake plates before returning toward the Brooks table once again. As she approached, Ethan's voice had already sharpened against the soft restaurant atmosphere. You disappeared during negotiations with Peterson Capital and never explained why. Noah exhaled slowly while staring down at the tablecloth. I told you there were personal reasons. Ethan leaned back coldly. That answer cost this company $12 million. Richard Brooks finally spoke quietly beside them. Ethan. But Ethan barely heard him now. Months of frustration sat heavy beneath his calm appearance. You keep asking everyone to trust you while giving nobody a reason. Claire carefully placed the dessert plates down one by one while silence tightened around the table. Noah looked exhausted now, not defensive anymore. Just tired. Some things mattered more than money at the time. Ethan laughed quietly beneath his breath. That sentence only sounds noble when somebody else is paying the consequences. Claire noticed Richard Brooks watching his sons with deep sadness hidden behind tired eyes. It was not anger inside the old man anymore. It was disappointment. The kind parents carried when love failed to hold a family together. Claire gently poured coffee into Richard's cup first, then Noah's. Finally Ethan's. "Would you like cream or sugar, sir?" she asked softly. Ethan looked up toward her. "Do I look like someone who takes sugar?" Claire remained calm. "I do not know what kind of burdens make someone bitter." Noah suddenly looked down, trying unsuccessfully to hide a reaction, while Richard coughed softly beside them. Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly. "You seem to have opinions about everything tonight." Claire adjusted the silver coffee pot carefully. "No, sir." Her voice stayed soft. "Only observations." Ethan leaned forward slightly now. "And what exactly have you observed?" The restaurant around them continued, glowing warmly beneath candlelight and jazz music, while snow pressed softly against the windows. Claire hesitated briefly before answering. "That everyone at this table keeps speaking about business." Her eyes moved gently toward Richard Brooks. "But nobody is talking about what is hurting this family." Silence immediately settled around the table again. Even nearby conversations somehow felt quieter. Ethan stared directly at Claire now, visibly unsettled by how accurately she had described the atmosphere surrounding them. Noah slowly lowered his eyes toward his untouched dessert plate. Richard Brooks looked toward Claire with quiet surprise softening across his face. Ethan finally gave a short, cold laugh. "Interesting." He picked up his coffee cup slowly. "A waitress playing therapist." Claire nodded once politely. "No, sir." She looked toward the table calmly. "Just someone who listens because nobody notices when she is standing nearby." Ethan opened his mouth to answer, but Richard spoke first. "Sit down for a second." Claire blinked softly. "Excuse me." Richard gestured gently toward the empty chair beside the table. "You have been standing all night." Claire immediately shook her head. "I cannot do that, sir." But Richard smiled faintly beneath the warm restaurant lighting. "I was not asking as a customer." Ethan looked genuinely surprised now. Noah looked relieved by the interruption. Claire hesitated awkwardly before finally lowering herself carefully into the edge of the empty chair for only a moment. Richard studied her quietly. "What is your name?" "Claire Dawson." Richard nodded slowly. "You remind me of someone I knew a long time ago." Claire smiled politely, though her eyes carried caution. "Hopefully someone kind." Richard's tired expression softened slightly. "Very." Ethan watched the interaction silently, while trying unsuccessfully to understand why his father suddenly seemed calmer speaking to a waitress than he had all evening speaking to his own sons. Claire prepared to stand again, but Richard quietly stopped her with another question. "Tell me honestly." His voice lowered gently. "Do you think families can survive after trust is broken?" Claire looked down briefly at the coffee cup, warming her hands before answering. "Only if someone decides being right matters less than being together." Ethan's expression shifted slightly at the sentence. Noah looked away toward the snowy windows immediately. Richard Brooks closed his eyes softly as though the words had reached somewhere painful inside him. Claire stood carefully afterward and lifted the silver tray once more. "Enjoy your dessert," she whispered gently before returning toward the service station beneath the warm glow of chandelier light. Ethan watched her disappear into the restaurant crowd, while something uncomfortable settled slowly inside his chest. Because for the first time all evening, he realized the quiet waitress understood his family better than he understood his own brother. The restaurant grew quieter as the night deepened over downtown Chicago. Snow continued sliding softly across the tall windows of Brooks and Hart Steakhouse, while the city lights below shimmered against frozen streets and slow traffic moving through December fog. Most guests had already finished dinner, leaving behind half-empty wine glasses and low conversations drifting beneath the sound of piano music near the fireplace. Claire Dawson stood beside the service station folding linen napkins carefully while other waitresses whispered about tips and celebrity clients near the kitchen entrance. But Claire's attention remained fixed on the private dining section where the Brooks family still sat beneath warm chandelier light. Tension had changed there now. Softer perhaps, more dangerous in quieter ways. Ethan Brooks leaned back in his chair staring toward the snowy skyline outside, while replaying Claire's words inside his head again. Only if someone decides being right matters less than being together. The sentence bothered him because part of him knew she was right. And Ethan Brooks hated truth when it arrived from people he considered beneath him. Noah sat silently beside the windows, turning an untouched whiskey glass slowly between his fingers, while Richard Brooks looked older by the minute beneath the amber restaurant lighting. Claire approached, carefully carrying the dessert check folder balanced against a silver tray. "Can I get anything else for the table?" she asked softly. Noah shook his head politely. "I think we are okay." Richard gave Claire a warm, tired smile. "Thank you for your patience tonight." Claire nodded gently. "Of course, sir." Ethan finally looked toward her again. Calm eyes. Same composed expression. No sign she cared whether wealthy people approved of her or not. Somehow that unsettled him more than arrogance ever could. "Actually," Ethan said suddenly while reaching into his jacket pocket, "there is one thing." Claire paused politely beside the table. Ethan removed several crisp $100 bills and placed them slowly onto the leather check holder. More money than most servers earned in a week. Noah immediately frowned. Richard watched quietly without speaking. Ethan looked directly at Claire. "You seem observant." His tone remained smooth, controlled. "Tell me honestly." He gestured lightly toward Noah beside him. "Do you think my brother is hiding something?" Silence settled instantly around the table beneath the warm restaurant glow. Claire looked down briefly toward the money resting on the table, then calmly back toward Ethan. "That is not my business, sir." Ethan gave a faint, amused smile. Everything becomes somebody's business eventually. Claire did not move. Not everything should. Ethan slowly leaned forward now, studying her carefully. "You know, most people would answer immediately for that kind of money." Claire's expression remained calm. "Then maybe most people need the money more than they need peace." Noah almost smiled despite himself, while Richard quietly lowered his eyes toward the tablecloth. Ethan tapped one finger lightly beside the stack of bills. "Take it." Claire looked at the money again, but made no effort to reach for it. "For what?" Ethan's voice lowered slightly. "For being honest." Claire met his gaze calmly. Honesty given a price usually stops being honest. For a moment Ethan said nothing. Snow drifted softly outside the windows while distant city lights reflected against the glass behind them. Around the restaurant, conversations continued quietly beneath candlelight and jazz music, but something heavier had settled over the Brooks table now. Ethan folded his hands slowly together. "Interesting answer." Claire carefully lifted the check holder and placed the money back toward him untouched. "You should keep it, sir." Ethan's expression hardened faintly. "You think I am trying to buy you?" Claire adjusted the silver tray against her arm. "I think hurt people sometimes test others before trusting them." Noah immediately looked toward her while Richard closed his eyes briefly as though the sentence had landed somewhere painful again. Ethan let out a quiet breath through his nose. "You always talk like this." Claire offered a small, polite smile. "Only when someone asks difficult questions." Before Ethan could answer, Richard Brooks suddenly pressed one hand lightly against his chest beneath the table. Very small movement, almost invisible, but Claire noticed instantly. Her eyes shifted toward the older man's pale expression and shallow breathing. "Sir." Richard tried dismissing it with a wave of his hand. "I am fine." But Claire had already stepped closer beside him. "No, you are dizzy." Ethan turned immediately toward his father. "Dad." Richard's breathing grew uneven now beneath the restaurant lighting while Noah quickly stood from his chair. Nearby guests began glancing nervously toward the private dining area as tension spread quietly through the restaurant. Ethan reached for his phone immediately. "Call an ambulance." But panic sharpened his voice faster than he realized. Noah moved toward his father too quickly, knocking over a water glass across the white tablecloth, while other waitstaff froze uncertainly nearby. Only Claire remained calm, completely calm. She gently knelt beside Richard Brooks while resting two fingers against his wrist. "Slow breaths," she said softly. "Look at me, not the room." Richard's breathing steadied slightly hearing her voice. Ethan stared at Claire in surprise while still gripping his phone tightly. "What is happening?" Claire looked up toward him calmly. "He is overwhelmed, possibly exhausted." Her eyes shifted toward the untouched whiskey beside Richard's plate. "And dehydrated." Noah grabbed the fallen water pitcher immediately while Claire loosened Richard's tie slightly beneath the collar. "Sir," she said softly, "I need you to breathe with me." Around them, Wealthy guests whispered nervously while restaurant staff hovered uncertainly near the kitchen entrance. Ethan looked completely unprepared for fear. Claire noticed that too. Men like Ethan controlled meetings, markets, companies. But fear inside family moments always exposed who truly knew how to stay steady. Richard finally inhaled slowly again, while color returned slightly to his face beneath the chandelier lighting. Claire remained beside him calmly until his breathing settled completely. Noah exhaled heavily in relief. Ethan lowered his phone slowly now, staring toward Claire with visible confusion. She had not panicked once, not even slightly. Richard finally opened his eyes fully again and looked toward Claire beside him. "You stayed calm," he whispered softly. Claire gave the faintest smile. Someone had to. Ethan looked at her differently now beneath the warm restaurant lights and drifting snow beyond the windows. Because for the first time that evening, the quiet waitress no longer looked weak to him at all. The restaurant slowly returned to normal after Richard Brooks regained his breath, but the atmosphere around the private dining section had changed completely. Snow continued falling outside the towering windows while warm amber light reflected softly across polished floors and half-empty wine glasses. Nearby guests resumed their conversations in lower voices now, though many still glanced occasionally toward the Brooks family table where the older billionaire sat quietly recovering beside his sons. Claire Dawson remained near Richard for several minutes longer, calmly checking his breathing while another waitress brought fresh water and clean linens to replace the overturned glass. Ethan Brooks stood motionless nearby with his phone still resting loosely in one hand. He hated feeling helpless. And moments earlier, helplessness had wrapped around him like cold winter air while the quiet waitress handled the situation better than anyone else in the room. Richard finally sat back carefully in his chair and gave Claire a tired smile. "Thank you." Claire nodded gently. "You should rest tonight, sir." Noah looked toward her with visible gratitude softening his exhausted face. "You knew exactly what to do." Claire adjusted the folded towel beside Richard's untouched coffee cup. "My mother used to have panic attacks after chemotherapy." Ethan looked toward her immediately hearing that. Claire spoke calmly, not emotionally, just truthfully. People panic more when everyone around them looks afraid. Richard studied Claire quietly now beneath the chandelier glow. "You take care of people often, do you not?" Claire gave the faintest smile. "Sometimes life gives you practice whether you ask for it or not." Silence settled softly over the table again while snow brushed against the windows overlooking Lake Michigan. Ethan slowly lowered himself back into his chair while watching Claire organize the table with quiet efficiency. She moved gently, calmly. No dramatic gestures. No need for recognition. Even now she looked almost embarrassed by the attention surrounding her. Most people would have used the moment to impress wealthy clients or secure favors. Claire Dawson seemed interested only in restoring peace to the room as quickly as possible. "You should sit down," Richard told her quietly again. Claire shook her head politely. "I still have tables waiting." Richard looked toward Ethan, then Noah, before returning his attention to Claire. "1 minute." Something in the old man's voice carried unusual sincerity. Claire hesitated briefly before sitting carefully at the edge of the empty chair once more. Ethan noticed how cautious she looked even while accepting kindness, as though life had taught her generosity often arrived with hidden conditions. Richard folded his hands together slowly atop the tablecloth. "How old are you, Claire?" 30. Richard nodded thoughtfully. "And you have always worked in restaurants?" Claire looked down briefly at the coffee cup, warming her hands. "No." Ethan watched her carefully now. "What did you do before?" Claire hesitated for the first time all evening. "I studied architecture." Noah blinked in surprise. "Seriously?" Claire nodded once softly. "A long time ago." Ethan frowned slightly. Why would someone leave architecture to work double shifts in restaurants? Noah shot his brother an immediate warning look at the bluntness of the question. But Claire answered without offense. "Because life changed." Ethan noticed she did not elaborate further. No complaints. No dramatic story designed to invite sympathy. Just quiet acceptance. Somehow that made the answer feel heavier. Richard's eyes softened gently. "You miss it?" Claire glanced toward the snowy skyline outside the windows before answering. "Sometimes." Ethan followed her gaze toward the city lights reflecting across frozen streets below. "Then why not go back?" Claire almost smiled. "Because hospitals do not accept unfinished blueprints as payment." Silence settled heavily across the table. Noah lowered his eyes immediately. Richard exhaled quietly, while Ethan looked toward Claire differently now. She had said the sentence softly, almost casually, but exhaustion lived beneath every word. Before anyone could respond, Claire's phone vibrated quietly inside her apron pocket. She apologized softly and glanced down at the screen. Ethan noticed the way her expression changed instantly. Concern. Worry she tried hiding too quickly. Claire declined the call immediately and slipped the phone back into her pocket. Richard looked toward her gently. Everything all right? Claire forced a polite smile. Yes, sir. But Ethan noticed the lie immediately. Not because she was bad at lying. Because he had spent years inside boardrooms learning how people disguised fear behind controlled expressions. Claire stood carefully from the table. I should get back to work. Richard reached for the check folder slowly. Before you go. Claire paused politely. Richard removed a black business card from inside his jacket and slid it toward her across the tablecloth. If you ever decide you want another chance at architecture, call me. Claire looked startled. Ethan looked equally surprised. Richard smiled faintly beneath the warm chandelier light. Good companies need people who stay calm when others lose themselves. Claire stared quietly at the business card resting near the candlelight. Brooks Development Group. Senior Executive Direct Line. Her fingers hesitated before touching it carefully. Sir, I cannot accept this. Richard's expression remained gentle. Why not? Claire lowered her eyes briefly. Because I did not help you expecting anything in return. Richard nodded slowly. Exactly. Ethan watched Claire closely now while snow drifted softly outside the windows. Most people would have grabbed the opportunity instantly. A direct connection to one of the wealthiest families in Chicago could change someone's life overnight. But Claire looked conflicted instead of excited. Almost uncomfortable. Please keep it anyway, Richard said quietly. Not as charity. His tired eyes softened toward her. As respect. Claire finally accepted the card with careful fingers. Thank you. Ethan noticed something strange then. The moment Claire slipped the card into her apron pocket, relief did not appear on her face. Guilt did. Very small. Nearly invisible. But enough for Ethan to notice. Before he could question it, Noah's phone suddenly buzzed against the table beside his whiskey glass. Noah glanced down quickly. His face changed immediately. Panic. Real panic this time. He stood from the table, so suddenly the chair scraped sharply across the floor beneath the quiet restaurant music. Ethan looked toward him immediately. What happened? Noah stared at the screen pale beneath the chandelier lighting, while snow continued falling outside across the sleeping city. The bank froze the emergency transfer account. Complete silence followed. Richard slowly looked up from his chair. What transfer account? Noah's voice lowered almost to a whisper. The one I opened to keep the company alive. Silence settled over the Brooks family table like winter fog rolling across Lake Michigan. Snow continued drifting outside the tall restaurant windows while warm jazz music played softly near the fireplace, completely disconnected from the tension now tightening beneath the chandelier lights. Noah Brooks still stood beside the table, gripping his phone tightly, while color slowly disappeared from his face. Ethan stared at him coldly across the white tablecloth. What emergency transfer account? Noah swallowed once before answering. The one I used to cover the manufacturing losses in Detroit. Ethan's expression darkened immediately. You moved company funds without authorization? Richard Brooks slowly straightened in his chair despite visible exhaustion. Noah. Noah looked toward his father quickly. I was trying to stop the layoffs. Ethan let out a quiet, disbelieving laugh beneath his breath. Unbelievable. Claire Dawson remained standing nearby holding her silver tray while every instinct told her she should walk away and give the family privacy. But something about Noah's expression stopped her. It was not the face of someone protecting himself. It was the face of someone terrified nobody would believe the truth. Ethan stood slowly now beneath the warm restaurant lighting. Do you understand what happens if the board learns this? Noah's voice lowered sharply. I know exactly what happens. Ethan stepped closer toward his younger brother. You risked the entire company because you wanted to play hero? No. Noah finally looked directly at him for the first time all evening. I risked everything because somebody had to protect the workers while you protected stock prices. Complete silence followed beneath the soft restaurant music. Nearby conversations faded again as several guests subtly glanced toward the Brooks table. Ethan's jaw tightened instantly. You do not get to lecture me about responsibility. Noah laughed quietly now, though sadness lived beneath the sound more than anger. Responsibility? He shook his head slowly. You have not stepped inside the Detroit plant once this year. Ethan crossed his arms coldly. Because I was fixing the financial disaster you created. Richard Brooks closed his eyes briefly as tension deepened between his sons once again. Claire watched carefully now from several feet away, while snow reflected softly across the windows behind them. Something about Noah's voice carried truth. Not polished truth designed for investors. Human truth. The kind people spoke only when exhausted enough to stop protecting themselves. Noah lowered his eyes briefly toward the glowing screen in his hand. The workers were about to lose health care before Christmas. Ethan remained unmoved. That still does not explain stealing company money. Noah finally snapped softly. I did not steal anything. The sentence landed harder than intended beneath the elegant atmosphere of the restaurant. Richard slowly rubbed one hand against his forehead. Enough. But Noah continued anyway now, years of silence finally breaking loose beneath the chandelier lights. You know what the Detroit manager told me 3 months ago? Ethan remained coldly silent. Noah's voice lowered. A single mother on the assembly line started sleeping inside her car because she could not afford rent after overtime cuts. Claire's fingers tightened slightly around the silver tray hearing that. Noah continued quietly. Another worker stopped buying insulin regularly to pay for his daughter's college applications. Ethan looked away briefly toward the snowy windows. Noah stared directly at him now. But all the board wanted to discuss was shareholder confidence. Richard Brooks finally opened his eyes again slowly. Tiredness covered his face completely now. Noah. Noah looked toward his father immediately. Richard's voice softened. Why did you hide this from us? Noah hesitated for several seconds before answering quietly. Because I knew Ethan would never agree. Ethan exhaled sharply through his nose. You are right. I would not. Noah almost smiled sadly hearing that. Exactly. Claire noticed something then. Richard Brooks was no longer looking at Noah with disappointment. He was looking at him with heartbreak. The kind fathers carried when they realized both their children were suffering in different ways while believing they stood on opposite sides. Claire quietly stepped backward, preparing to leave them alone at last, when Noah suddenly spoke again. There is something else. Ethan looked immediately irritated. Of course there is. Noah ignored him while staring toward Richard instead. The transfer account froze because the bank flagged unusual personal collateral. Richard frowned slightly. What collateral? Noah lowered his eyes. My apartment. Ethan blinked once in surprise. Noah continued quietly. And my retirement accounts. Silence filled the restaurant table completely. Even Ethan looked momentarily speechless now. Richard stared toward his younger son beneath the warm amber lighting. You used your own assets? Noah nodded once softly. The plant needed 6 more weeks to recover the contracts. Ethan looked genuinely unsettled for the first time all evening. Why would you do that without telling anyone? Noah finally looked exhausted beyond words now. Because nobody listens unless profits are involved. Claire felt something heavy settle quietly inside her chest hearing that sentence. She understood it too well. Invisible sacrifices always sounded foolish to people who never had to choose between survival and dignity. Richard Brooks slowly leaned back into his chair while emotion flickered behind tired eyes. You should have come to me. Noah smiled sadly. I tried. Ethan looked down briefly toward the untouched whiskey glass near his hand. For the first time tonight, uncertainty cracked through his confidence. Because Noah no longer looked irresponsible. He looked desperate, and desperation built from compassion was much harder to dismiss. Claire carefully turned toward the service station again, finally deciding the family needed privacy now more than ever. But as she passed beside the table, Richard's quiet voice stopped her gently. Claire. She turned politely. Richard studied her for one thoughtful moment beneath the warm restaurant light. You hear people carefully. Claire remained still. Richard's tired eyes shifted briefly toward his sons before returning to her. Tell me honestly. His voice lowered softly. Does this family sound broken to you? Claire hesitated carefully because truth carried weight inside moments like this. Snow drifted silently outside while candlelight flickered across the table between the father and his sons. Finally, Claire answered quietly. No, sir. Ethan looked toward her immediately. Claire's eyes moved gently between both brothers. Broken families stopped caring. Silence followed. Claire lowered her voice slightly. This family still hurts because everyone here loves each other more than they know how to admit. Richard Brooks stared quietly at her beneath the chandelier light, while Noah lowered his eyes toward the table again. Ethan remained motionless beside the snowy windows overlooking Chicago. Because deep inside himself, he suddenly realized the quiet waitress understood something terrifyingly true. The opposite of love was never anger. It was indifference. And despite everything said tonight, nobody at this table had stopped caring yet. The restaurant had grown nearly empty by midnight. Snow continued falling steadily across downtown Chicago while the lights from passing taxis reflected against frozen sidewalks below Brooks and Hart Steakhouse. Most guests had already left, leaving behind quiet candlelight, folded napkins, and the lingering scent of coffee and expensive whiskey beneath the warm amber glow of the chandeliers. Only a few tables remained occupied now, and even the jazz pianist near the fireplace played softer melodies as though the entire evening had slowly exhaled its tension into the winter night. At the Brooks family table, silence rested heavily after Claire Dawson's words. Broken families stop caring. Richard Brooks remained seated quietly beside the windows overlooking Lake Michigan while his sons avoided each other's eyes beneath the soft restaurant lighting. Noah sat back down slowly, exhausted from finally revealing the truth about the Detroit plant and the personal assets he had secretly risked to protect the workers there. Ethan stood near the table with one hand resting against the back of his chair, while something unfamiliar moved quietly beneath his controlled expression. Doubt. Claire returned to the service station carrying empty coffee cups while trying to place emotional distance between herself and the family drama unfolding behind her. But the night no longer felt simple. She had spent years learning how to survive quietly without becoming emotionally involved in strangers' lives. Tonight, that invisible boundary kept dissolving. Near the kitchen entrance, Chef Luis approached while removing his apron. "You should go home soon," he said gently. Claire nodded distractedly while organizing receipts beside the register. Her phone vibrated again inside her pocket. She glanced down quickly. Hospital billing office. Claire closed her eyes for one brief second before silencing the call again. Chef Luis noticed immediately. "Everything okay?" Claire forced a faint smile. "Just tired." But exhaustion had begun living permanently behind her eyes months ago. The kind created when one person carried too many responsibilities alone for too long. Across the restaurant, Ethan watched Claire from the private dining area, while Noah quietly explained more details to Richard about the Detroit factory losses. Ethan barely listened now. Instead, he kept replaying every conversation from the evening inside his mind. Claire refusing the money he offered. Claire calming his father while everyone else panicked. Claire somehow understanding his family better after a few hours than he had managed in years. None of it made sense to him. People usually revealed themselves quickly around wealth, ambition, fear, greed. But Claire Dawson seemed completely untouched by any of it. Richard slowly stood from his chair at last, leaning carefully against the edge of the table while Noah immediately moved to help him. Ethan stepped closer too, but Richard raised one tired hand gently. "I am all right." His voice sounded softer now somehow. Older. He looked toward both sons beneath the warm chandelier lighting. "We are going home." Noah nodded quietly. Ethan remained silent. Richard glanced once toward Claire near the service station before reaching into his coat pocket. "Actually," he murmured softly, "I need a moment first." He slowly crossed the restaurant floor toward Claire while Noah and Ethan watched from several feet away. Claire looked up politely as Richard approached. "Are you feeling better, sir?" Richard smiled faintly. "Because of you." Claire lowered her eyes slightly, uncomfortable with praise. Richard studied her carefully now beneath the dimming restaurant lights. "You know," he said quietly, "my wife used to speak exactly the way you do." Claire looked surprised. Richard's expression softened with distant memory. Calm people frighten the world sometimes because they force everyone else to hear themselves clearly. Claire almost smiled hearing that. Richard slowly removed a folded envelope from inside his coat pocket and placed it gently on the counter beside her. Claire frowned slightly. "Sir." Richard raised one hand softly before she could refuse. "It is not money." Claire hesitated before touching the envelope carefully. Inside rested a business card and a folded architectural drawing printed on expensive paper. Claire stared at it immediately. Her breath caught softly in her throat. It was a sketch of a children's community center overlooking Lake Michigan. Elegant lines. Beautiful structure. The kind of design she once dreamed about creating before life moved in harder directions. Richard watched her expression quietly. Your university professor sent that to me 6 years ago. Claire looked up stunned. What? Richard nodded slowly. He wanted Brooks Development Group to sponsor your graduate fellowship. Claire's face slowly lost color beneath the chandelier light. I never knew about this. Richard's tired eyes dimmed sadly. Because your mother became sick before the interview process finished. Snow drifted quietly outside while Claire stared down at the architectural sketch, trembling slightly between her fingers. Years disappeared inside her chest all at once. The future she buried. The dreams she stopped speaking aloud because survival cost less emotionally than hope. Richard lowered his voice gently. Your professor called you the most emotionally intelligent designer he had ever taught. Claire blinked quickly, embarrassed by sudden emotion gathering behind her eyes. That was a long time ago. Richard looked toward the sketch softly. Talent does not disappear simply because life interrupts it. Ethan stood several feet away listening now while realization slowly settled inside him piece by piece. Claire had not become small because she lacked ability. She became quiet because life demanded sacrifice before ambition. Richard rested one hand lightly against the counter. The fellowship funds still exist. Claire looked at him immediately. Sir, I cannot accept that. Richard smiled sadly. You keep refusing kindness as though accepting help makes you weaker. Claire lowered her eyes toward the architectural drawing again. No. Her voice softened almost to a whisper. I am just afraid hope becomes expensive once you let yourself feel it again. Silence wrapped gently around them while snow continued falling outside across the sleeping city. Ethan felt something tighten painfully inside his chest hearing those words. Because suddenly he understood the difference between himself and Claire Dawson. Ethan had spent his life believing strength meant controlling outcomes. Claire survived by learning how to endure disappointment without becoming cruel. And somehow that made her stronger than anyone he had ever known. By the time Brooks and Hart Steakhouse prepared to close for the night, snow had covered nearly every street below the Chicago skyline in quiet silver. The city looked softer beneath winter darkness, as though even the sharp edges of downtown towers had surrendered temporarily to silence. Inside the restaurant, candles burned low beside empty wine glasses while staff quietly cleaned tables beneath warm amber light. Claire Dawson stood alone near the service counter folding her black apron carefully after finishing her shift. The architectural sketch Richard Brooks had given her remained tucked safely inside her bag beneath the counter, though she had not looked at it again since accepting it. Some dreams felt too fragile to touch twice in one night. Near the private dining section, Ethan Brooks stood beside the windows overlooking Lake Michigan while Noah quietly helped Richard into his winter coat. Tension between the brothers had softened slightly after the truth about the Detroit factory finally surfaced, but years of misunderstanding still lingered heavily beneath every unfinished sentence. Ethan watched Claire from across the nearly empty restaurant again. She moved slowly now, exhaustion visible in every small motion she no longer bothered hiding. Yet, even tired, she still paused to help another waitress carry stacked dishes toward the kitchen before gathering her own things. She gave more energy away than she kept for herself. Somehow that realization unsettled Ethan more than anything else tonight. Noah approached him quietly while Richard spoke with the restaurant manager near the entrance. You were hard on her earlier, Noah said softly. Ethan kept his eyes toward the snowy windows. I was hard on everyone. Noah shook his head faintly. No, his voice lowered carefully. You were testing her. Ethan remained silent because denying it would have been dishonest. Noah glanced toward Claire near the service station. People like her make you uncomfortable. Ethan finally looked toward his younger brother. What does that mean? Noah folded his arms loosely beneath his coat. You understand ambition, competition, negotiation. He nodded subtly toward Claire. But you do not understand kindness that expects nothing back. Ethan almost responded immediately, but the words stopped somewhere inside him because part of him knew Noah was right. Claire never tried impressing anyone tonight. Never tried gaining advantage from wealthy people surrounding her. Even when Richard offered opportunities most would beg for, she looked more frightened than excited. Ethan lowered his eyes briefly. She thinks accepting help makes her weak. Noah smiled sadly. No, his voice softened. I think life taught her help usually comes with conditions. Across the restaurant, Claire quietly said goodbye to Chef Louise before slipping her worn winter coat over her waitress uniform. The coat looked too thin for Chicago weather. Ethan noticed that immediately, too. Claire reached into her bag for gloves when a folded paper accidentally slipped onto the floor beside the service counter. She quickly bent down to grab it, but not before Ethan noticed the corner of an overdue medical notice stamped in red letters. Claire immediately tucked it away again, though her calm expression tightened for just 1 second. Ethan looked toward Noah slowly. She is carrying something else. Noah followed his gaze briefly before nodding. Most strong people are. Richard Brooks finally approached both sons near the entrance beneath the dimmed chandelier lights. I am heading home. His tired eyes moved between Ethan and Noah carefully. You two should talk before another year disappears. Noah lowered his eyes while Ethan remained quiet beside the snowy windows. Richard sighed softly. Families break slowly. His voice carried exhaustion deeper than age now. Usually because pride sounds smarter than vulnerability. Before either son could answer, Richard walked toward Claire near the front entrance. Ethan and Noah watched quietly as the older man smiled warmly while saying something soft enough they could not hear. Claire listened politely before suddenly embracing Richard gently beneath the warm restaurant lighting. The moment looked strangely emotional. Honest in a way expensive places rarely felt anymore. Richard finally disappeared into the elevator with his driver, while Noah headed toward the parking garage moments later after receiving another call from Detroit. That left Ethan alone inside the nearly empty restaurant. Claire stood near the front entrance pulling on knitted gloves while snow swirled outside the glass doors beyond her. Ethan approached slowly. You are still here. Claire looked up slightly surprised. So are you. Ethan glanced toward the storm outside. Chicago looks terrible tonight. Claire smiled faintly. Chicago always looks beautiful in snow if you stop rushing long enough to notice it. Ethan studied her quietly. Strange again. She found beauty in places most people only complained about. Do you need a ride home? He asked suddenly. Claire shook her head immediately. No, thank you. Ethan frowned slightly. It is below 20 degrees outside. Claire adjusted the strap of her worn bag across one shoulder. I take the train. Ethan noticed hesitation in her voice this time. Very small, almost invisible. At this hour? Claire looked toward the snowy street beyond the glass doors. It is fine. Ethan lowered his voice slightly. Claire. She looked toward him carefully. Ethan hesitated before speaking again, because pride still complicated kindness for him sometimes. You do not have to survive everything alone. Silence settled softly between them beneath the warm restaurant lights. Claire's eyes shifted briefly toward the floor before returning to his face. People usually say that right before asking for something. Ethan absorbed the sentence quietly. No anger, just experience. He finally nodded once. Fair enough. Claire studied him for a long moment then. Really studied him for the first time all night without the invisible wall professionalism usually placed between them. Ethan looked tired too now. Not physically, emotionally. Like someone carrying years of pressure without ever learning how to rest inside his own life. Claire softened slightly. You love your brother. Ethan looked surprised by the sudden statement. Claire continued quietly. You are just afraid caring about people makes you easier to hurt. Ethan stared at her speechlessly beneath the dim chandelier glow. Because somehow the waitress standing beside the snowy entrance had understood him more honestly in one evening than most people had in years. Claire reached slowly for the restaurant door handle, then paused before leaving. Strength is not controlling everyone around you, Ethan. Her voice remained soft, calm. Sometimes strength is choosing not to punish people for being human. Then she stepped out into the falling snow beneath the glowing Chicago skyline, while Ethan Brooks remained standing alone inside the warm restaurant. Suddenly realizing the quiet waitress had just changed something inside him he did not yet know how to name. Chicago looked almost silent beneath the heavy snowfall after midnight. Streetlights glowed through drifting white clouds while frozen wind swept across empty sidewalks and sleeping intersections below the skyline. Claire Dawson pulled her thin winter coat tighter around herself as she walked toward the elevated train station 6 blocks from Brooks and Hart Steakhouse. Her boots pressed softly through fresh snow while the cold air burned lightly against her tired face. Behind her, Downtown towers shimmered like distant gold against the dark winter sky. But Claire barely noticed the beauty tonight. Her thoughts remained tangled around the architectural sketch resting carefully inside her bag and the strange emotional weight of everything that had happened with the Brooks family. She had spent years avoiding hope because hope required energy she no longer trusted herself to waste. Yet Richard Brooks had quietly reopened a door she thought life permanently closed. Across the street, Ethan Brooks sat motionless inside the back seat of his black sedan while watching Claire disappear slowly through the snow-covered sidewalks ahead. His driver waited patiently at the curb beneath the soft glow of passing headlights. Ethan should have gone home already. He had investor calls beginning in less than 6 hours. But something inside him refused to leave. He kept hearing Claire's voice repeating quietly inside his mind. Sometimes strength is choosing not to punish people for being human. Nobody had ever spoken to him that way before. Not employees, not investors, not even family. Because most people spent their lives carefully managing his reactions instead of challenging them. Ethan finally leaned forward slightly. "Follow her." The driver glanced into the mirror briefly. "Sir." Ethan kept his eyes toward the snowy street ahead. "Just make sure she gets home safely." The black sedan moved quietly through downtown traffic several car lengths behind Claire, while snow continued falling across the city. Claire reached the elevated train platform moments later and stood alone beneath flickering station lights, while icy wind swept through the open tracks overhead. The station looked nearly abandoned at this hour except for one elderly man sleeping quietly near the far bench beneath layers of worn blankets. Claire checked her phone again. 3 missed calls from the hospital billing office. 1 voicemail from an unknown number. She closed her eyes briefly before slipping the phone back into her coat pocket. Across the street below the station platform, Ethan remained inside the parked sedan, watching her through the falling snow. He noticed the way she rubbed warmth slowly into her hands between breaths. He noticed how exhausted she looked now, without the calm professional composure she carried inside the restaurant. And for the first time in years, guilt moved quietly through him. Not because of business, because of perspective. Ethan had spent most of his life believing struggle looked dramatic and obvious. But Claire Dawson carried hardship so quietly the world barely noticed she was drowning beneath it. The train finally arrived with a low metallic groan against the frozen tracks. Claire stepped inside the nearly empty car and sat beside the window while snow-covered buildings blurred slowly past beneath dim station lights. Ethan watched until the train disappeared into the winter darkness. Then finally he leaned back against the leather seat with a long silent breath. "Home, sir?" the driver asked carefully. Ethan stared out toward the falling snow. "No," he paused briefly. "Take me to the Detroit plant." The driver blinked in surprise. "Tonight?" Ethan nodded once slowly. "Tonight." Nearly 4 hours later, dawn began softening the horizon beyond Detroit, while freezing gray light spilled across the enormous manufacturing complex Brooks Development Group nearly abandoned months earlier. Ethan stepped out of the black sedan, wearing the same charcoal coat from dinner, while icy wind swept across the empty parking lot. Smoke rose faintly from the factory vents against the pale morning sky. Inside the plant, tired workers moved quietly between machines while fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Ethan walked through the building slowly, saying nothing. He noticed old equipment still running beyond safe capacity. Workers wearing worn gloves. Coffee stations stocked with generic supplies because budgets had been cut repeatedly during the last fiscal quarter. And everywhere he looked, people still showed up despite uncertainty hanging over their jobs like winter fog. The plant manager finally approached nervously near the assembly floor. "Mr. Brooks." Ethan looked toward him calmly. "How bad is it?" The manager hesitated. "Honestly." Ethan nodded once. The older man sighed heavily. "Most executives stopped visiting months ago." His eyes lowered briefly. But Noah kept coming. Ethan remained silent while the manager continued softly. "He paid overtime himself twice when payroll got delayed." Ethan slowly looked around the factory again while realization settled deeper inside him piece by piece. Noah had not disappeared from responsibility. He had disappeared into responsibility nobody else wanted to carry. Hours later, as morning sunlight finally broke through thick winter clouds above Detroit, Claire Dawson stepped quietly into St. Catherine Medical Center, carrying a paper cup of coffee and exhaustion beneath her eyes. The hospital hallways smelled faintly of antiseptic and stale air, while tired nurses moved between patient rooms beneath fluorescent lighting. Claire walked toward room 417 and gently pushed the door open. Inside, her mother rested quietly beneath pale blankets beside the window while heart monitors beeped softly in the background. Claire's shoulders relaxed slightly, seeing her asleep peacefully. But then she noticed the hospital administrator standing near the room entrance holding a clipboard against his chest. His expression immediately warned her something was wrong. "Miss Dawson," he said gently. Claire's stomach tightened instantly. "What happened?" The administrator lowered his voice carefully. "Your insurance extension request was denied this morning." Silence filled the room except for the steady heartbeat monitor beside her mother's bed. Claire stared at him quietly while exhaustion finally cracked through her calm expression. "How long do we have?" The administrator looked genuinely sympathetic. 72 hours before billing suspension begins." Claire lowered her eyes slowly toward the paper coffee cup, trembling lightly between her fingers. She had already sold almost everything valuable she owned months ago. Her apartment savings were gone. Her architecture dreams were gone. And now even time itself suddenly felt expensive. Outside the hospital windows, snow continued falling softly across the waking city, while Claire stood silently beside her sleeping mother, completely unaware that several hundred miles away, Ethan Brooks had just made a decision capable of changing both their lives forever. 3 days later, Chicago woke beneath pale winter sunlight, reflecting softly across frozen streets and rooftops covered in fresh snow. The city looked quieter after the storm, as though the entire skyline had paused long enough to breathe again. Inside St. Catherine Medical Center, Claire Dawson sat beside her mother's hospital bed, holding a paper cup of cold coffee between both hands while exhaustion rested heavily beneath her eyes. The past 72 hours had passed in a blur of billing offices, insurance calls, and silent fear. She tried hiding behind calmness. Her mother slept peacefully near the window while weak sunlight filtered through pale curtains onto the blankets. Claire had barely slept herself. She spent most nights pretending numbers could somehow change if she stared at them long enough. Medical bills stacked inside her bag beside the folded architectural sketch Richard Brooks had given her. Two versions of her future resting painfully beside each other. The quiet beep of the heart monitor filled the room, while Claire rubbed tired fingers gently against her temples. Then came a soft knock at the open hospital door. Claire looked up expecting another administrator. Instead, Ethan Brooks stood quietly in the doorway wearing a dark winter coat dusted lightly with snowflakes. For one brief moment, neither of them spoke. The hospital room suddenly felt very small beneath the pale morning light. Claire blinked softly in surprise. "What are you doing here?" Ethan stepped inside carefully while holding a thick folder against one arm. "Your mother's nurse told me where to find you." Claire immediately frowned slightly. "How?" Ethan hesitated briefly. "Richard helped." Claire looked away toward the window almost instantly. "You should not be here." Ethan nodded once slowly. "Probably." But he remained standing there anyway. Silence settled gently between them while the winter sunlight stretched softly across the hospital floor. Claire finally stood from beside her mother's bed and stepped quietly into the hallway, closing the door halfway behind her. Hospital workers moved softly through distant corridors while vending machines hummed near the elevators at the far end of the floor. Claire crossed her arms lightly beneath her coat. "Why did you come?" Ethan studied her carefully now beneath the fluorescent hospital lights. She looked even more exhausted than the night at the restaurant. Still calm, still composed, but fragile around the edges in ways she no longer had energy to hide. Ethan lowered his voice softly. "I went to Detroit." Claire looked surprised. "What?" Ethan leaned lightly against the hallway wall. "I saw the plant Noah was trying to save." He paused briefly. "I finally understood what he was protecting." Claire remained silent. Ethan glanced down momentarily before continuing. "You were right." Claire frowned slightly. "About what?" Ethan looked directly at her. "I spent years confusing control with strength." The sentence landed quietly between them. Honest. Uncomfortable. Claire lowered her eyes briefly toward the hospital floor. Ethan slowly held out the folder he carried. "This belongs to you." Claire hesitated before accepting it carefully. Inside rested several official documents stamped with Brooks Development Group letterheads. Her eyes moved quickly across the pages. Graduate Architectural Fellowship Reinstatement. full tuition sponsorship, paid apprenticeship contract, medical assistance approval. Claire's breathing caught softly in her throat. What is this? Ethan's voice remained calm now, different somehow, softer than before. A chance to stop surviving long enough to start living again. Claire immediately shook her head and tried handing the folder back. No, Ethan did not take it. Claire. Her eyes filled instantly with emotion she struggled to contain. I cannot accept charity. Ethan nodded slowly as though expecting the response. Good. He looked toward the folder gently. Because it is not charity. Claire stared at him silently while winter lights spilled through the hospital windows behind them. Ethan continued carefully. My father reopened your architecture fellowship because he believes in your talent. His voice lowered. And I approve the medical support because nobody should lose their future trying to save someone they love. Claire blinked quickly, embarrassed by sudden tears gathering despite her effort to stay composed. Why would you do this for me? Ethan looked down briefly before answering honestly. Because you walked into a room full of powerful people and reminded all of us how small we had become. Silence settled softly between them, while distant hospital announcements echoed faintly through the hallway speakers. Claire stared down at the documents, trembling slightly between her fingers. For years she had carried everything alone because dependence frightened her more than exhaustion. But standing here now, she realized something painful. Sometimes refusing kindness became another form of fear. Ethan watched her quietly. You said something the night we met. Claire looked up slowly. Ethan's eyes softened beneath the pale hospital lighting. You said strength is choosing not to punish people for being human. He paused briefly. I think I finally understand that now. Claire lowered her gaze toward the folder again, while tears slipped silently down her face before she could stop them. Not dramatic tears, just quiet release after carrying too much for too long. Ethan stepped slightly closer, but kept respectful distance between them. Your mother's treatments are covered starting today, he said softly. And the fellowship interview is waiting whenever you are ready. Claire closed the folder carefully against her chest as though afraid the papers might disappear if held too loosely. I do not know what to say. Ethan almost smiled then. Small. Honest. That makes two of us. Through the nearby hospital window, snow continued falling softly across Chicago, while morning sunlight slowly brightened the frozen city below. For a long moment, neither of them spoke again. They simply stood together inside the quiet hallway while life moved gently around them. Finally, Claire looked toward Ethan beneath tired eyes, carrying something warmer now than fear. You changed. Ethan glanced toward the snowy skyline outside the window. No, his voice stayed soft. I think you just made me honest enough to notice who I was becoming. Claire smiled faintly through lingering tears while Ethan opened the hospital room door quietly for her. Inside, her mother still slept peacefully beneath the pale winter light. Claire paused at the doorway before turning back toward him one last time. Ethan stood silently in the hallway with snow melting slowly from his dark coat, while morning light touched the tiredness beneath his eyes. For the first time in a very long time, he no longer looked like a man trying to win every battle around him. He simply looked human, and somehow, that made him stronger than power ever did.